The wind had teeth and it chewed on the edges of her worn wool shawl, a merciless gnawing that promised to strip the last of her warmth. Alara felt its bite in her bones. A deep, invasive cold that had little to do with the temperature. This land was not made for mercy. It was a canvas of ochre dust and skeletal sagebrush, stretched taut under a vast, indifferent sky. Every step was a negotiation with the cracked earth, a tremor of pain shooting from her swollen ankles up her impossibly long legs. At 6 feet and 7 inches, she was a landmark of her own, a solitary, swaying pine in a landscape of scrub. A landmark for scorn, for whispers, for the pointing fingers that had followed her from the town that now lay a lifetime behind her. They had called her an omen, a giantess, a thing unnatural. And now, she carried a secret that felt just as monstrously proportioned within her. A heavy, kicking truth that stretched her skin and her soul to their breaking points. The weight of it bent her forward. Her hand splayed against the small of her back as she crested a low rise. Below her, nestled in a shallow, wind-scoured valley, was a ranch. It was not a welcoming sight. It looked as haunted as she felt, a collection of weathered gray buildings clinging to the earth like old scabs. A thread of smoke, thin and listless, rose from a stone chimney, the only sign of life. Desperation was a sharper spur than hope. She had no choice but to descend. Each footfall sent a jolt through her, a reminder of the precious, terrible burden she protected. The baby shifted, a rolling, powerful movement that stole her breath. Fear, cold and metallic, coated her tongue. The gossip of the women in town echoed in her memory, their cruel speculations about the child of such a creature. What kind of thing would it be? They had looked at her belly with a mixture of pity and revulsion. Now, alone, their words were a chorus in her mind. Her shadow stretched long and distorted before her as she approached the main house, a dark finger pointing toward the door. The air was still, the world holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to pause. She could feel eyes on her before she saw him. He emerged from the barn, a silhouette against the fading light. He was not a tall man, but broad, built of the same unyielding material as the land itself. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, his gaze fixed on her, missing nothing. She saw the initial flicker of surprise at her height, quickly shuttered behind a stony mask. He stopped 20 paces away, a rifle held loosely in one hand, not threatening but ready. His face was a roadmap of hardship, scored with lines of sun and sorrow. His eyes, though, were the most desolate landscape of all, empty, flat, guarded. She tried to speak, but her throat was a desert. All she could manage was a ragged breath. The silence stretched, pulled thin and tight between them. It was a silence that spoke of isolation, of a man who had forgotten the shape of conversation. The despair she had been holding at bay for days finally crested, a wave that threatened to drown her. This was it, the end of the road. Another set of hard eyes, another closed door. Tears she didn't know she had left to cry burned hot behind her own. She was too large, too strange, too pregnant. A calamity in human form. She swayed, the world tilting on its axis, and her hand went to her belly, a gesture of pure, primal instinct. Protect the child, even if the world would not. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his expression unchanging, as if he were assessing livestock with a blight. Alara stood her ground, her body a column of exhaustion and defiance. She had walked until her feet were raw, until the world had blurred into a smear of brown and gray. She would not collapse now, not at the feet of this silent, sentinel-like man. She drew a breath, the cold air scraping her lungs, and found a voice, though it was as cracked and dry as the ground beneath her. "Water," she rasped. Please, it was a shard of a word, but it hung in the air between them, a fragile offering. He gave no sign of having heard, his gaze dropping from her face to the pronounced swell of her stomach, lingering there for a beat too long. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his features. Not disgust, not pity, but something colder, sharper. It was a look of profound and immediate rejection. He turned his head slightly, spitting a thin stream of tobacco juice onto the dust. The gesture was dismissive, a full stop to a conversation that had not even begun. Her heart, which had been a frantic bird against her ribs, seemed to fall. She had been a fool to hope for anything more. This place was a tomb and he was its keeper. She should turn, walk back the way she came, and find a private place to let the wilderness take her. But the child moved again, a powerful, insistent kick against her ribs, a reminder that her life was no longer solely her own. This silent, stubborn life inside her demanded she be stubborn, too. She squared her shoulders, the movement costing her more than he could ever know. "I can work," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I'm strong." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Her strength was a memory, leached away by miles and hunger and the ceaseless work of growing another human being. He remained silent, his eyes two chips of flint. He was waiting for her to break, to give up and drift away like the tumbleweeds that collected against his fences. He hated her presence. It radiated from him, a palpable aura of resentment. It was in the set of his jaw, the rigid line of his shoulders. She was an intrusion, a complication he had no desire to entertain. The house behind him seemed to groan in the wind, its windows like vacant eyes. It was a place that had shuttered itself against the world, and she was knocking at its door. Inside her, a quiet fury began to smolder, a coal buried deep in the ash of her despair. She had been judged her entire life for the body she inhabited, for the space she took up in the world. She would not be dismissed so easily now. "I won't be a burden," she insisted, her voice rising. "I just need a place." Until her voice trailed off. Until the baby came. She could not say the words. To speak of it felt like tempting a terrible fate. The silence returned, heavier this time, freighted with all the things they were not saying. He knew. Of course he knew. And it was the source of the profound animosity in his gaze. It was not her height that offended him. It was the life she carried. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, the colors of a fresh bruise. The cold deepened. He finally moved, a slight, grudging shift of his weight. "There's a cot in the barn," he said. His voice a low, gravelly rumble, as if pulled from the earth. "Water pumps by the trough. Don't touch anything else." He turned without another word and walked back toward the house, the rifle still in his hand. The door closed behind him with a sound of utter finality, the sound of a vault being sealed. He had not offered food. He had not offered warmth. He had offered the barest minimum required to keep her from dying on his doorstep. It was not charity. It was a transaction. A cot in the barn for the removal of her unsettling presence from his line of sight. Elara stood alone as darkness consumed the ranch. The fragile thread of smoke from the chimney, her only proof that she was not entirely alone in the world. She made her way to the barn, her long frame casting a spectral shadow in the moonlight. The air inside was thick with the scent of hay, dust, and animal sweat. It was a smell of life, and yet the place felt as empty and haunted as the man who owned it. The days bled into one another, a slow, monotonous rhythm of survival. Elara woke each morning on the lumpy cot in the barn, the scent of old hay a constant companion. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through the gaps in the plank walls, a persistent thief of warmth. Her host, whose name she learned was Silas only by seeing it crudely carved into a saddle rack, remained a distant, forbidding figure. He was a creature of routine. He rose before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the hard-packed earth the only alarm she had. He would work from sunup to sundown, a tireless, solitary engine of labor, moving with a grim purpose that seemed to be the only thing holding him together. He never spoke to her. Their communication was a silent, tense ballet of avoidance. He would leave a small portion of food, usually a piece of hardtack and some jerky, on a crate near the barn door. He would fill a bucket of water from the pump and leave it beside the food. He did these things when he was certain she was inside, her towering shadow not falling across his path. In return, she made herself as small as a 6'7" woman could be. She took on what chores she could manage, her movements slow and deliberate. She mucked out the one stall that held his horse, a rangy, melancholic beast with eyes as sad as its owners. She stacked firewood, her long arms making the work easier than it might have been for another. She mended a section of fence that had come down, her large, capable hands surprisingly deft with the wire. She did not do it for his approval. She knew none would be forthcoming. She did it to earn her keep, to quiet the voice in her head that screamed she was a burden, a charity case. She did it to prove to herself, more than to him, that she was not yet broken. She watched him from a distance, from the shadows of the barn or the corner of the small corral. She saw the way he cared for his horse, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he curried its coat. She saw the methodical way he repaired a broken harness, his focus absolute. He was a man who understood how things worked, how to fix what was broken. Except, it seemed, for himself. There was a profound brokenness about him, a hollowness that even his relentless work could not fill. One afternoon, while sweeping the barn, her broom uncovered a small, wooden toy horse lying half-buried in the dirt of a long empty stall. It was crudely carved but clearly made with love, its edges softened by the grip of a small hand. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the simple lines of its form. As she held it, the barn door creaked open. Silas stood there, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light. He had come back for a tool he'd forgotten. His eyes landed on the toy in her hand. For the first time, the mask of indifference cracked. A spasm of pure, undiluted pain crossed his face, so raw and visceral it made her flinch. His jaw clenched, and the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The air in the barn grew thick and suffocating with a grief so immense it felt ancient. He turned on his heel and walked away, forgetting what he had come for. Elara looked down at the toy horse, its small, wooden form now impossibly heavy in her palm. This was the source of his ghosts. This was the reason for the emptiness in his eyes, the coldness in his heart. It was the reason he looked at the life growing inside her not just with resentment, but with something akin to terror. He was not merely a man who disliked children. He was a man who had been destroyed by one, by the loss of one. She carefully placed the toy back where she had found it, gently covering it with a handful of clean straw, reburying the secret that was not hers to keep. A fragile, invisible thread of understanding now connected her to the silent man in the house. They were both haunted, each carrying the ghost of a child, one lost, one not yet found. And in this desolate, forgotten corner of the world, their two solitudes had collided. The baby was a constant, powerful presence, a turbulent sea within her. Some days its movements were slow and languid, the gentle rolling of a wave. On others, it was a tempest, a flurry of kicks and jabs that left her breathless and bruised from the inside out. It was strong, terrifyingly so. She would lie on her cot in the dark, a hand spread over the tight drum of her belly, trying to measure the force of its thrusts, trying to imagine the scale of the child that could produce them. The fear was a living thing now, a serpent coiling in her gut. The women in town had whispered about it. A giantess like her. The babe will be a monster. It will tear her in two. Their voices, once just cruel background noise, were now her most intimate companions. Their predictions a litany of horror that played on a loop in her mind. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, a particularly violent kick struck a nerve, sending a bolt of white-hot pain down her leg. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound, and collapsed against the rough wood of the corral fence, her legs giving way beneath her. She clutched her belly, gasping for breath, tears of pain and sheer terror streaming down her face. The world narrowed to a pinprick of agony. She was going to die out here. She was going to die, and this child, this powerful, unknown creature, would die with her. The thought was unbearable, a grief so sharp it eclipsed the physical pain. She didn't hear him approach. One moment she was alone with her terror, the next his shadow fell over her. Silas stood there, a bucket in his hand, frozen mid-stride. He stared at her, crumpled at the base of the fence, her face contorted in a mask of suffering. His own face was a battleground of conflicting emotions. The instinct to retreat, to wall himself off from her pain, was warring with something else, something deeper and more human. He took a hesitant step toward her, then stopped. He did not know what to do. His hands, so capable with tools and leather and animals, were useless in the face of this raw female agony. "It's the baby," she managed to choke out. The words ripped from her. "It's too strong." The confession hung in the air between them, small and pathetic against the vastness of the landscape. She looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears, and for the first time, she let him see the full depth of her fear. She did not try to hide it, did not try to be the strong, resilient creature she had forced herself to be. She was just a woman, terrified of what her own body was creating. "I think it's going to kill me," she whispered, the admission of final surrender. She saw the guarded walls in his eyes crumble, just for a second. The raw pain he had shown in the barn over the toy horse resurfaced, a flicker of shared understanding of loss, of the terrible fragility of life. He still did not move closer, but he didn't retreat. He stood his ground, a silent witness to her unraveling. Finally, she gathered the strength to say the thing that haunted her waking and sleeping hours, the source of all her dread. She looked down at her own monumental form, at the impossible curve of her belly. "I'm carrying a giant baby," she confessed, her voice barely audible. Like me, the words were not an accusation, not an excuse. They were a simple, terrible statement of fact. A calf too large for its mother's hips would kill them both. It was a brutal piece of ranching logic that he would understand. She was applying the cold arithmetic of animal husbandry to her own life, to her own child. The silence that followed was different from the ones that had come before. It was not empty or hostile. It was heavy, filled with the weight of her stark, terrifying admission. She had handed him the jagged pieces of her deepest fear, and now she waited to see what he would do with them. Silas did not offer words of comfort. He was not a man built for such things. The soft currency of reassurance was foreign to him. Instead, after a long, tense moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he turned and walked back to the house. Alara's heart sank. She had shown him her weakness, her terror, and he had turned his back on it. He was leaving her to her fate. She sagged against the fence, the last of her fight draining out of her, leaving only a hollow ache. But a few minutes later, the cabin door opened again. He emerged carrying a steaming mug in one hand and a thick, woolen blanket in the other. He approached her slowly, cautiously, as one might approach a wounded animal. He stopped a few feet away, placing the mug on the top rail of the fence. Then he unfolded the blanket and, with a stiff, unpracticed motion, draped it over her shoulders. The wool was coarse and smelled of wood smoke and him, a clean, earthy scent. The warmth of it was immediate, a shocking comfort against her chilled skin. He backed away, retreating to his customary safe distance. "Willow bark tea," he grunted, gesturing toward the mug. For the pain, he said nothing more. He picked up the bucket he had dropped and went about his evening chores, his movements as rigid and deliberate as ever. But something had shifted. The invisible wall between them, once made of solid ice, was now fractured. It was a hairline crack, but it was there. That night, the food he left on the crate was different. Alongside the usual hardtack was a bowl of thick stew, with discernible chunks of meat and vegetables. It was still warm. Alara ate it slowly, gratefully, the warmth spreading through her body. A small but powerful act of care that spoke louder than any words he might have uttered. In the days that followed, the small changes continued. He began leaving the cabin door slightly ajar when he was inside, a subtle invitation that she was no longer entirely an outcast. He would chop extra wood and stack it just outside the barn door for her, saving her the long walk to the woodpile. He never acknowledged these acts, and she never thanked him for them. Theirs was a language of gestures, of deeds done in silence. He began to speak, not to her directly, but near her. He would mutter to his horse as he brushed it down, his voice a low rumble. "Stubborn old fool, aren't you? Just like everyone else on this damn rock." Sometimes he would comment on the weather to the sky itself. "Looks like a blow coming in from the north." A bad 1 inch. She knew the words were meant for her, a way of communicating without breaching the fortress of his solitude. He was warning her, preparing her. She watched him more closely now, seeing not just the hardness, but the deep grooves of exhaustion and sorrow that framed his eyes. She saw the way his hand would sometimes stray to his side, as if to touch a phantom pain. He was a man held together by sheer force of will, and her presence, her impending crisis, was threatening the precarious balance of his world. One afternoon, he was repairing the handle of a water pump, cursing under his breath as a piece of metal refused to fit. Alara, watching from a distance, saw the problem. She walked over, her long shadow falling over his work. He stiffened, expecting her to retreat. Instead, she pointed with a long finger. "The washer is upside down," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He stared at the mechanism, then back at her. A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, perhaps even grudging respect, crossed his face. Without a word, he disassembled the piece, flipped the washer, and put it back together. Fit perfectly. He gave the handle a test pump, and a clean stream of water gushed out. He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked at her. For the first time, he met her gaze directly, holding it for more than a fleeting second. "Humph," was all he said, but it was enough. It was an acknowledgement, an admission that she was not just a looming catastrophe, but a person with a brain and observant eyes. A crack in the ice had become a fissure. The sky began to curdle a few days later, the clear, sharp blue slowly thickening to a bruised, sullen gray. The wind, once a steady, predictable presence, became fitful and menacing, whispering threats around the corners of the buildings. Silas's predictions had been right. A storm was coming, a monster gathering its strength in the northern mountains. He worked with a new, frantic energy, his movements stripped of their usual deliberate pace. He was securing the ranch, battening down the hatches against the coming siege. He checked the roof of the house, nailed a loose board on the barn wall, and herded his horse into the relative safety of its stall. He did not ask for her help, but Alara worked alongside him anyway. She gathered loose tools and stored them in the workshop, her long reach allowing her to secure things he could not. She helped him stretch a heavy canvas over the dwindling haystack, their hands occasionally brushing in the cold air, small jolts of contact in their silent world. The air grew heavy, charged with a strange electric stillness. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Silas paused, scanning the horizon. "It'll be on us by nightfall," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Get inside the barn. Stay there." He looked at her then, a long, assessing gaze that took in her swollen form. "You have what you need?" She nodded. He had already moved a small stove, a pile of firewood, and an extra lamp into her corner of the barn without comment. He was preparing a shelter for her, a safe room, but it was also a quarantine. He was ensuring she would be contained when the crisis hit. The storm arrived not with a roar but with a sigh. The first snowflakes drifted down, fat and lazy, melting as they touched the ground. But they were the vanguard of a vast army. Within the hour, the air was a blinding, swirling vortex of white. The wind howled, a physical force that battered the walls of the barn, making the old timbers groan in protest. The world outside vanished. There was only the storm, a furious, living entity that had swallowed the ranch whole. Alara sat on her cot, the woolen blanket Silas had given her wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and listened to the blizzard's rage. The small stove glowed cherry red in the corner, a fragile beacon of warmth against the overwhelming cold. She felt a strange sense of calm. The world had been reduced to this small, protected space. The decisions had been taken out of her hands. All she could do was wait. Sometime deep in the night, a sharp, unfamiliar pain seized her. It was low in her back, a deep, grinding ache that was different from the usual discomforts of her pregnancy. She stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. Couldn't be. It was too soon. The pain subsided, then returned, stronger this time, wrapping around her abdomen like an iron band. A wave of nausea washed over her. It was happening. Here, now, in the heart of a blizzard, with only a haunted, silent man for help. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her calm. She tried to breathe, to remember the soothing words of the midwife in the town she'd last called home, before they'd run her out. Breathe with the pain, girl. Don't fight it. The contraction crested and then slowly faded, leaving her trembling and slick with sweat. Another one began to build almost immediately, harder, more insistent. The baby was coming. It was fighting its way into a world that was currently a maelstrom of ice and wind. She heard a tremendous crash from outside, the sound of a great tree limb surrendering to the storm. The barn shuddered. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Silas was in the house, a world away across the screaming expanse of white. He would never hear her. She would have to do this by herself. The thought was paralyzing. Another contraction ripped through her, this one forcing a cry from her lips. It was a sound of animal pain, swallowed by the roar of the wind. The baby was not waiting. It was coming now. The pain was a relentless tide, pulling her under, then releasing her just long enough to gasp for air before the next wave crashed over her. Alara lost all track of time. There was only the rhythm of the contractions, each one more powerful, more demanding than the last. The small, safe world of the barn had transformed into an arena, a place of primal struggle. She was no longer just a woman. She was a body at war with itself, a vessel straining to release its precious, dangerous cargo. She had tried to be quiet, to stifle her cries, but the agony was too immense. She moaned, her voice a raw, desperate sound that was stolen by the wind. In a moment of clarity between the waves of pain, she realized the futility of her situation. She was too big, the baby was too big, and the labor was too fast, too violent. Something was wrong. This was not the gentle unfolding the midwife had described. This was a brutal, desperate siege. Her strength was failing. The fear she had held at bay for so long finally consumed her. She was going to die. A grotesque landmark in a forgotten barn. Another secret for the haunted ranch to keep. Just as she surrendered to the blackness that licked at the edges of her vision, the barn door was wrenched open with a shriek of protesting wood. A blast of snow and ice swirled into the space, and a figure, caked in white, stumbled inside. It was Silas. He slammed the door shut, leaning against it, his chest heaving. His face was nearly blue with cold, ice clinging to his eyebrows and the rough stubble on his jaw. He must have heard her, or perhaps some instinct, some long-dormant sense of duty, had driven him out into the teeth of the storm. He stared at her, his eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She was contorted on the cot, her face pale and slick with sweat, her knuckles white where she gripped the thin mattress. This was his worst nightmare made real. The specter of birth, of life and death hanging in the balance, had invaded his sanctuary. His first instinct was clear on his face: to flee, to turn and plunge back into the clean, impersonal violence of the storm, to escape the messy, terrifying ordeal unfolding in his barn. He took a half-step back toward the door. Alara saw the terror in his eyes, the deep, visceral rejection. And in that moment, her own fear was burned away by a sudden, white-hot rage. A protective, maternal fury that was as powerful as any contraction. "Don't you dare!" she snarled, the words torn from her throat. "Don't you dare leave me!" Her voice, raw with pain, cut through the howl of the wind. It was not a plea. It was a command. It struck him with the force of a physical blow. He froze, his hand on the latch of the door. Her gaze locked with his. A silent, desperate battle of wills waged across the small, lamplit space. She would not let him run from his ghosts, not when she was facing her own mortality. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. Then, something inside him broke. The haunted, empty look in his eyes was replaced by a grim, reluctant resolve. He slowly, deliberately, took his hand off the door. He walked over to the stove, his movements stiff, and began to add more wood, his back to her. He was staying. He was not offering comfort or kindness, but he was offering his presence. He was choosing to face the thing that had broken him. He turned, his face still a stone mask, but his eyes were different. They were the eyes of a man who had made a decision. "Water," he said, his voice rough. "You'll need water. And rags. Clean ones." He was all business now, all practicality. He was retreating into the world he understood. The world of tasks, of logistics, of survival. He moved around the barn, gathering what they would need, his focus absolute. He was treating this not as the birth of a child, but as another kind of disaster to be managed, like a fire or a flood. For Alara it was enough. He was here. She was not alone. The next contraction hit, and as she cried out, he flinched but did not look away. He stood his ground, a silent, grim-faced witness in the heart of the storm. The hours that followed were a blur of agony and effort, a primal, exhausting dance on the edge of oblivion. The storm outside raged in symphony with the storm inside her. Silas moved with a grim efficiency, his earlier terror now channeled into a focused, mechanical competence. He kept the fire roaring, the heat a welcome shield against the encroaching cold. He tore strips from a clean linen sheet he'd fetched from the house, his hands, calloused and rough from ranch work, surprisingly steady. He brought her water, holding the tin cup to her lips between the crushing waves of pain. His face averted, his eyes fixed on some distant point over her shoulder. He did not speak unless necessary, and his words were clipped, functional commands. Breathe, push, again at some point. In the depths of her delirium, she saw his mask slip, as a particularly brutal contraction seized her. She screamed, a long, tearing sound of a soul being ripped apart. In that moment, she saw his eyes close, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. A flicker of an old, unhealed agony crossed his face. He was not here with her in the barn. He was somewhere else, some other time, reliving a nightmare she couldn't possibly comprehend. A woman screaming, a life slipping away. The memory was so powerful it seemed to suck the air from the room. But then he opened his eyes, and the grim mask was back in place. He was pushing through his own hell to stay present in hers. He had to. The labor was not progressing. It was a stalemate, a brutal tug-of-war between her body and the child, and she was losing. Her strength was gone, her pushes becoming weaker, her breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "It's stuck," she sobbed, the words thick with despair. "I told you. It's too big." Silas looked at her, then at the impossible mound of her stomach. The cold, hard logic of the rancher took over. He had seen this before with cows with ewes. A calf turned wrong, too large for the passage. He knew what it meant. He knew the grim choices that had to be made. He disappeared into the storm again and returned moments later, his hands carrying a flask of whiskey and a small, leather-wrapped roll. He knelt beside her, his face inches from hers. His eyes, for the first time, were not empty. They were filled with a terrible, bleak resolve. "This is going to hurt," he said, his voice low and steady. "But it's the only way." He uncorked the flask and pushed it to her lips. Drink. The whiskey burned a raw path down her throat, but it sent a welcome fire through her veins. He unrolled the leather packet. Inside were several polished metal instruments. He had been a medic, she realized with a jolt, or a veterinarian. It didn't matter. He knew things. He knew what had to be done. He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not a monster or a ghost, but a man about to perform a terrible, necessary act. "You have to trust me," he said, and in that moment she did. She nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. He placed his hands on her, his touch impersonal, clinical, yet surprisingly gentle. He was assessing, determining the problem. She felt a shift, a blinding, searing pain that made her arch her back and cry out. He was trying to turn the child. His face was a mask of concentration, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. "Now," he commanded, his voice sharp. "Push. Push like your life depends on it," and she did. She gathered every last scrap of strength, every ounce of will she possessed, and pushed. She screamed, a sound that was not human, a sound of pure, elemental force, of life clawing its way into the world. There was a final, tearing agony, a sudden release of pressure, and then a thin, wavering cry filled the barn, cutting through the howl of the wind. The baby's cry was the most beautiful and terrifying sound Alara had ever heard. It was thin, yes, but it was strong, filled with a shocking vitality. The storm outside seemed to pause, its fury momentarily abated, as if to listen to this new, defiant sound. Alara fell back against the cot, utterly spent, her body a hollow, trembling vessel. She was alive. Through the haze of exhaustion, she saw Silas, his broad back to her. He was holding the baby, wrapped in a piece of the clean linen sheet. He stood perfectly still, a dark, unmoving silhouette against the lamplight. She couldn't see his face. She couldn't see the child. A new fear, sharp and cold, pierced through her relief. Was the baby all right? Was it normal? "Silas?" she whispered, her voice a thread. He didn't answer. He didn't move. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken dread. Had her fears been realized? Had she brought something monstrous into the world? A creature whose very appearance had frozen this stoic, unflinching man in his tracks? She struggled to sit up, her muscles screaming in protest. "Let me see," she begged, her voice cracking. He turned slowly. His face was a wreck. Tears streamed freely down his weathered cheeks, carving clean paths through the grime and sweat. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the small bundle in his arms, his expression one of utter, soul-shattering devastation and awe. He walked toward her, his steps unsteady, and knelt by the cot. He gently placed the baby in her arms. Alara looked down, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw a perfectly formed child, red-faced and squalling, with a shocking thatch of dark hair. He was big, certainly long-limbed and solid, but he was not a monster. He was just a baby, a beautiful, healthy baby boy. Relief washed over her in a dizzying wave, so potent it left her lightheaded. She pulled the bundle close, inhaling the unique, sweet scent of new life, her son. As she looked down at his tiny, perfect face, she noticed it. Around his neck, impossibly, was the cord. It was wrapped twice, a deadly snare that should have killed him. Silas. He had not just turned the baby. He had unwrapped the cord in the final, desperate moments. He had saved him. He had saved them both. She looked up at Silas, who was still kneeling by the bed, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The dam of his grief had finally broken, washed away by the tidal wave of new life he had been forced to usher in. All the years of loss, all the pain he had locked away behind a wall of silence and solitude, came pouring out. He was not crying for her or for the baby. He was crying for the child he had lost, for the wife he had been unable to save, the toy horse in the barn, the scream he had relived in her own. It all clicked into place. He had faced his ghost and, in doing so, had laid it to rest. Alara reached out a trembling hand and placed it on his rough, calloused one. He flinched at the contact but did not pull away. They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them, a strange, broken, and beautiful tableau in the heart of the dying storm. The mother, the child, and the haunted man who had, against all odds, become their savior. The wind outside began to soften its howl, its rage spent. A new, profound quiet settled over the ranch, a quiet not of emptiness, but of peace. The world was born anew in the morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed, sculpted in pristine, silent white. The sun, brilliant in a cloudless sky, cast long blue shadows and made the snow glitter as if sewn with diamonds. It was a world scrubbed clean, and inside the small ranch house, a new world was also taking shape. Silas had insisted she move from the barn. He had carried her, his strength surprising, his touch gentle, and settled her into the only bed in the house, his bed. He now slept on a pallet by the fire, a silent, watchful guardian. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a nursery. The air, once stale with solitude and grief, was now filled with the scent of milk and clean linen and the faint, sweet smell of a newborn. It was punctuated by the small, demanding cries of Alara's son, whom she had named Samuel. A simple, sturdy name. The silence between Alara and Silas had changed. It was no longer a tense, hostile thing, but a comfortable, shared space. It was the quiet of two people who had been through a fire together and had emerged on the other side, altered. They spoke more now, though their conversations were still spare, stripped to their essential core. He would ask if she needed anything. She would ask if he had eaten. The questions were mundane, but the care behind them was a palpable thing. He was a natural, if reluctant, caretaker. He cooked for her, simple, nourishing stews and broths. He kept the fire blazing. He washed the baby's linens in boiled water, his large, rough hands clumsy but determined as he hung them near the hearth to dry. He never held the baby again after that first, shattering moment. He would watch him, though. When he thought Alara was asleep, she would see him standing over the cradle he had hastily fashioned from a wooden crate. His expression a complex mixture of sorrow and a fragile, nascent wonder. He was keeping a safe distance, as if the child were a flame that might rekindle his old pain. Alara healed. Her remarkable body, which had endured so much, began to knit itself back together. Her strength returned day by day. With it came a profound sense of peace. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was gone. She looked at her son, at his powerful little body and his calm, watchful eyes, and felt not terror, but a fierce, boundless love. She had created this life. She had fought for him. She had won. One afternoon, as she was nursing Sam by the fire, Silas came in from his chores, stamping the snow from his boots. He stopped by the hearth, ostensibly to warm his hands, but she knew he was watching them. "He looks like you," she said softly, not looking up from the baby. Silas grunted, a non-committal sound. "He's got your hands," she continued, tracing the baby's long, delicate fingers. "And your height." I'll wager a small smile touched her lips. For the first time, she could think of her own towering form not as a curse, but as a gift she had passed on. "He is strong," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had commented on the child. "I had a daughter," he added, the words so quiet she almost missed them. He was still looking into the fire, his profile etched by the flickering light. "Her name was Clara. She was small, delicate." He paused, the silence stretching. "The fever took them both, her and my Mary. The doctor was too late. It was a confession, an explanation, an epitaph. All the years of his haunted silence, summed up in a few stark sentences." Alara's heart ached for him, for the unimaginable weight of the grief he had carried alone for so long. She said nothing. There were no words that could touch a pain that deep. Instead, she simply held her own son a little tighter, a silent acknowledgement of the precious, fragile gift of his life. The ranch was no longer haunted by the ghosts of a wife and child. Their memory was still there, a sad, sweet undercurrent, but it was now joined by the powerful, living presence of a new mother and a new son. The house had a future again, and in the quiet space between two solitary people, a fragile, unspoken partnership had taken root, nurtured by shared hardship and the miraculous, healing power of a new life.